Hi, guys. Welcome back to episode 13. Here we have an ordained minister, Stewart Roten. I'm Stephen Getz.
And I'm Azzalan. And Stuart, if you can tell us a bit about yourself before we begin the interview,
Okay.
just so our viewers have a sense of.
My name is Stewart. I live in Northwest North Carolina. The work that I do now is as a healthcare chaplain. Been doing that for 24 years. In the early parts of that, and for several years before, I worked in a research lab for Wake Forest Baptist Hospital, and before that for Duke University. I am married for 37 years, and my wife and I have 4 children, and we have 4 grandchildren. And we've had lots of dogs, cats, iguanas, and all sorts of other animals through the years.
Sounds like a very interesting career and also wonderful life in
Yeah,
general, I
yeah,
have
for
to say.
sure.
So, with that in mind, I think we can get on to our first question, actually. So, our first question is, so while you're reading through the Bible, especially through Genesis, you tend to notice that a lot of people are living well into centuries, say Noah for over 900, and then all of his descendants also for centuries. So why is that so?
Well, I believe they lived in a very pure environment. They were close to creation. Their genetics were great. There was nothing to corrupt that in any way that we know of. The first 10 generations, almost everybody lived to be 900 years, at least the ones who are named. Now, there is one exception to that. His name is Enoch. He only got 365 years. I'm sure he felt cheated in some sense. But the scripture doesn't say that he died as it does for all the other 9. It says that God took him, and it says it differently. And a lot of people believe that God took him prematurely to heaven uh, or to be with him in some sense without passing through the normal process of death. But before the flood, long, long, long lives. Um, we know now that about 8% of our human genome is infected with viral remnants from all the infections that we and our ancestors have had. We live in an environment that is not exactly as clean as it once was. We see lots of things in the news about contamination of water and ocean and all sorts of other things. So there's a good argument to be made for reduced lifespan based on a changing environment. Now, if you were to look at those 10 people who lived prior to the flood, and then look at the individuals who lived afterward, whose ages are given, you see that there's a flat line before the flood. It averages 912 years. Adam, Seth, on down to Noah. Noah is the last of the super long lived individuals who made it to 900 plus. Noah's son, Shem, who lived 100 years before the flood, he lived 500 years after the flood. So he still lived a very long time. But after that, it drops off pretty dramatically. There's a handful of people who get 400 plus, and then there's another good sized handful who get 250 plus. And after that, it drops steadily toward 120. And so by the time Psalm 90 is written, we're told that we get 70 years. And if we're truly blessed, we get 80. But even those years are filled with labor and difficulty.
Interesting. So you say it's because of a more pristine of an environment that we can't really have today with all of our advancements for better or worse, and also the fact that over time the human genome has changed as
It has
well.
changed some. We're not dramatically different, but there are a lot of diseases now that didn't exist then. Um, and I would suspect that the environment is a big part of it. I would also think that just the changing nature of our morality and the changing nature of our relationship with God has something to do with it. And God does seem to cap that number at some point. So perhaps we're simply not meant to live so very long now.
Yeah, yeah, that's an interesting perspective. Um, Now shifting like realms, kind of to actually the opposite side. Um, when considering Satan, is Satan seen, so like just for some context before I go into this question, in Judaism, there is really no devil figure. Rather, like the snake represents humanity's evil side, and there's kind of um, an interim before both, I guess, the medium ground and hell. But in Christianity, there's the Satan figure. And just like asking, is Satan seen as an actual being, or is he viewed more as the concept of evil? So, like, basically, is that his own like figure, or does he identify with kind of the concept that Judaism has of a figure like that?
I'm sure you'll find many Christian groups who do see Satan as more of a an aspect of personality that everybody has to contend with. But my view, and I think the view of most of the people that have influenced me, is that Satan is an actual personality, an individual, a spiritual being of great power, who has intellect, will. He certainly has a name. We just used it. Um, he interacts with people. He is capable of logic, persuasion, deception, all things that are aspects of personality. And so I believe very strongly that he exists, that he is and we may get to the hereafter and find that he is actually a she. I'm not sure. I'm sure there are lots of guys with difficult relationships who uh, are certain that he's a she. But I feel that Satan is a personality. You see that in the encounter with the snake in the garden. He speaks to Eve. He convinces her that God's holding out on her and that she ought to take of the fruit, and she gives it to Adam, of course, and things seem to go downhill from there. You see Satan speaking, and he's named as Satan in the book of Job in the Old Testament, the first few chapters. We don't see him afterward, but in those first few chapters, he has conversations with God about the nature of God's goodness and how that goodness influences Job to be a good man. We also see Satan in the New Testament having conversations with Jesus. There's a period of temptation that's found in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 4, and the other synoptic Gospels also. And he comes to Jesus at a point of weakness because Jesus has fasted for a very long time and his body is weak. And the first temptation is, well, make some bread out of one of these stones. And then there's another temptation about jump from the top of the temple. The angels will catch you. That's God's promise. And then there's a third temptation of, take a look around, see all the kingdoms of the world. They're mine, and I can give them to you if you will just worship me. And so there are conversations that take place, and conversations and will and persuasiveness, intellect, logic, all these things flow from personality. And so I believe that Satan is a being with a distinct personality and existence that's separate from the human condition.
That's definitely interesting because I always viewed him as almost like the concept of the id, like in psychology, where it's, your primal desires, your basic instincts. Because it seems like these interactions with him are very, primal. They appeal to
Mm-hmm.
primal um emotions like greed and hunger and envy and lust. So that's interesting that he's seen as like a being himself and not so much as a
Well,
concept.
I think sometimes people go a little far with viewing Satan in this personal way. And so they attribute all their shortcomings, all their failures, bad decisions to some kind of satanic influence. But most of us do have enough of the internal darkness of our own just because we're born into a sinful world with a sinful nature, and we do want things we should not have, and it doesn't take a lot of external influence to cause us to spend valuable mental resources looking for those things. It's there, and we do choose it in many cases. So Satan doesn't have to be individually present in every situation for that kind of influence to do bad things. There's enough of the darkness in us, but there's enough of him in our world and in situations that do push us sometimes where we should not go.
Yeah, okay, that also makes sense because you can't really attribute everything to, forces out of your control. You also have to accept the fact that you yourself are also capable of committing evil deeds. And it's that, like, understanding that really propels responsibility and morality. I have the ability to do bad, and I could easily choose it, but I still decide to do good. And for that, you can develop a strong moral compass. But
And hopefully we do. You know, if you look at a very young child, you really don't have to teach that child to be deceptive. They will invariably say they didn't break the dish. You don't have to teach young children to not share. They already know how to do that. What we have to do is teach them to be truthful, teach them to be honest and sharing, and to get along with other people and to coexist in a world with many others just like them. And that development is very important.
Yeah, yeah, it's super interesting. Like basically the human like tendency beforehand to consider those options. And Oz, do you want to move on to the next question? Like with that said,
yeah, sure. So, regarding the afterlife and yeah, so regarding the afterlife and how one will be judged, are non-Christians held to the same standards as Christians? Or, in other words, is a man still condemned for being non-Christian even if they are a good person in life?
Um, you'll find many groups that will debate this. Um, and I really wish there was another way, but the Christian faith, and really, I suppose every faith has an exclusivity that is sometimes uncomfortable. And I really wish that God would had some sort of a workaround. But as the gospel is presented in the New Testament, we're told that those who believe in the Son have life, and those who do not have life. Jesus said, "Those who believe in me are not condemned," but he says those who do not are condemned already. So it's not that we do bad things or good things that shift us from condemnation to life. We're born in condemnation. We're born in a world that is controlled by, influenced by, saturated in sin. We have this sinful nature. We're already that way from the moment of our first awareness. And what we need is a rescue. Jesus said that he had come to seek and to save that which was lost. And he also said that the mechanism for that rescue was his own sacrifice, his bodily death. And Paul told us that we are reconciled to God by the death of his son. Can you hear my cat in the background? His name is Fitz, and he just made an appearance. But because of the huge gift that is given in the person of God's Son, to walk away from that for whatever reason is a massive, massive risk. And so when the gospel is presented, it comes with an obligation to seriously consider it. And it's very important to choose well, because it is a matter not only of life and death in this existence, but also in the eternity to come.
So it's not so much about the necessarily good and bad, but more so about acceptance and denial.
It begins with acceptance and denial. The good and bad, we believe, are important to determining the degree of punishment or reward, as the case may be, in heaven or hell. So there are many people who could have done much better who will not receive the same reward as those who really live the saintly life. And there are some people who deny and yet lead basically good lives whose punishment will not be so severe. But the stark contrast between heaven and hell is such that it is so important to choose well and to choose life. And Jesus said, I've come to give them life. And those who believe, I give them a life that does not end. And it is a gift. It's not something that we earn in any sense. And the person who comes to faith in Christ is not in any sense better than the person who denies Christ. We're all born the same. And we all have hopefully the same opportunity through hearing the presentation of the gospel. But having come to faith does not make a person in themselves good. Righteousness is something that is given to us. We're told that Abraham believed God and God counted it to him as righteousness. Now, we also know he was a pretty good guy, had a few slip ups, but he was a pretty good guy. But the real goodness, the goodness that mattered, was a gift from God that God imputed into him.
So to be a good person, just for curiosity, to be a good person, but to still deny would be akin to purgatory, or
Well, if you're a Roman Catholic, you probably believe in purgatory. I'm a mix of Southern Baptist and Pentecostal, and we don't do purgatory. Be a great idea, but it would be an innovation, and God doesn't permit those things, at least in our view of it.
interesting. So, Stephen, want to move on
Yeah,
to the next?
yeah. It's interesting how like all the different, I mean, although there are Jewish denominations, there are so many different Christian denominations, and I guess like from an outside view, at least I fail to recognize like how different each denomination is, each faction.
I was trying to get some sense of how many Christian denominations there are, and I would have thought hundreds, but the number really is in the thousands, perhaps tens of thousands. I saw one statistic that said that there were something like 45,000 groups that had some distinctive theology that they claimed was different than those around them. That's a lot to keep up with. There are websites and study groups that do try to make sense of the great numbers of differences between groups. One that comes to mind is called Ready to Harvest. And this is a Bible college professor who simply details this is what this group believes. He doesn't pass judgment on it one way or the other, or to say that they're right or wrong in their distinctive beliefs. But I have found him helpful. But there are groups who will take almost any of the Christian ideas, doctrines, teachings, and take one side or the other of it while holding on to most or even all of the others. Some groups stress that God is so sovereign that we really don't make decisions. Some groups stress that God is sovereign, but he leaves it completely up to us. Some groups stress that the Holy Spirit is so active in our lives that he can completely take us over and guide our every thought and movement. Some groups stress that there's a central authority figure in their faith that outranks all other authorities in the Christian faith, except for Jesus himself. Others have very loose structures, and I tend toward the loose structure. I don't know how many kinds of Baptists there are, and that's how I grew up. But they're Independent Baptist, Southern Baptist, General Baptist. There's all kinds of names for them. Southern Baptists are very well organized and have a nationwide, even worldwide outreach. The church I grew up in had a community outreach, and that was it. There was no strong connection to any other church. The church that I'm in now, and I'm a member of it. I'm not on staff, so to speak, though they do let me teach and occasionally speak in Sunday services. But the church that I'm in now is somewhere in the middle of what Baptists are. We have a loose relationship with a number of other like-minded Baptist churches, but we don't have a strong connection to any national groups in that way. All kinds of ways to organize, all kinds of ways to express distinctive doctrines and teachings, all kinds of views even of God's presence in the world, all kinds of views of what God is going to do in the future, all kinds of ways to express what spiritual gifts the Holy Spirit awakens in the life of the believer, and hundreds of other ways to describe the differences. It is really a vast number of differences amongst Christians.
Yeah, and I mean, as you just go over that, you can just, and there's so many more differences beyond that, and just like understanding, it's just kind of crazy, and it kind of forces you to always take a perspective whenever considering Christianity because you can never really consider it as a whole, given just how many differences there are.
No, and there are people on one side of whatever spectrum who do not consider the people on the other side of the spectrum to be truly in the faith. And I don't know how that stacks up with any of the other major faiths in the world, but
Yeah,
Christians can
um,
be a cantankerous bunch.
wow, that's that's interesting, and like that there are honestly parallels for that in Judaism. There are like Hasidic Jews, which are like hyper religious Jews, typically in Israel, and they often don't align with like the majority of the Jew population, and they're kind of held separate. They're definitely held separate. And I
Yeah.
guess that's where you can see like parallels between the different distinctions between the faiths.
Yeah, it's just
So
different interpretations of the same truth, I guess,
yeah,
and that goes for everything.
And that's human nature.
Yeah,
Um, any any group of Christian ministers, they're going to look at a text or an idea and have some nuance. And sometimes the nuances are very helpful because it allows us to see the other facets of the gem, so to speak. And sometimes that makes it a little richer. Sometimes it's a distraction, and if it gets into an argument, then it can be destructive.
yeah, yeah.
But some
And
some
on
ideas
that,
some ideas are worth
sorry,
uh, are worth uh, are worth the argument.
yeah, and some are not, but I guess that's like what makes communication so important. Um,
I did not hear all of that last sentence, brother.
Yeah, I was just saying like, and sometimes it's not, and that's why communication is important because like at a certain point, like you need to understand the differences and just respect how
Yeah.
different they are, and kind of
Well, if you're driving down the average street and you pass by a church that has a certain name, it may be the name of the individual church, but it may have also a denominational name there. You can make some assumption as to what it is they believe, how they teach, and even the nature of their worship services. And I think a lot of groups now are intentionally leaving that denominational identifier out of their signs and off their literature, so that people might be curious and come on in and see what it's about without making the prejudgment.
Yeah, yeah, that's actually super important. Just going in with an open mind and like on that same path, given that like you see that trend within Christianity where maybe there is a bit of polarization, there needs to be more open-mindedness. Um, where do you see and how do you see Christianity in your everyday life?
Well, I want it very much to be a framework for how I relate to other people. Um, and it's super important to how I do the work that I do because I meet a lot of people who are in crisis, usually some medical issue. I want to be able to relate to them. I want to have an appreciation for their life story and things that are important to them. To hear what it is they value. I want them to feel that I've been accommodating and welcoming to them. I want to be trusted in my community as a man. I want my children to believe that I'm still there for them and that I want to express. I can't do it the way I once did, but I want to express wisdom. There was a time when they were young, and I could simply say, "This is what you're going to do," and kind of hope they would do it. But now that they're all grown and they're having children of their own, I have to express that differently, and it comes across as more of a fatherly, grandfatherly wisdom. Um, but my faith leads me to want to express something of who God is in the daily grind, and in the daily opportunities and the daily storytelling. I want to be seen that way, but I also want the peace that comes because I know that no matter what happens in this life, uh, there is something bigger that is creating opportunities and creating this plan for me and helping me through it. My family and I have faced some serious losses over the years, and having that faith allowed us to believe that those we said goodbye to were not lost to us forever, that we would see them again, and that when we saw them again, it would be good. That was helpful. It's also helpful to know that when I really mess up, and Lord knows we all do, but when I really mess up, that I can do something about it. I may not be able to fix the thing that I broke, but I can have a genuine forgiveness for it, and I can have a sense of this has been dealt with on a cosmic level, and it won't always be hanging over my head. So I can know that when I stand before the judge of all the earth, that I can stand not based on how many things I got right and how many things I didn't, but on the fact that I knew the one who really gave himself for me to purchase my redemption and to give me this hope.
Wow, yeah, so you kind of just like, I guess what I'm taking from it is your everyday life is Christianity because you use such as a vehicle to just not only get you through life, but propel like interpersonal connection with like whoever you're talking to, get you through those like rough points in life, and even like cherish those during the happy points of life.
It gives me a lot to be thankful for, and then someone to thank. Certainly, I can thank those around me who are such a big part of all of life's successes and joys. I can also thank them for not abandoning me when things were difficult. Um, so, yeah, there's all that.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's actually very similar to how other religions sort of act as so like a fountain of wisdom sort of that you can draw from. So in Judaism there's a section called I believe in the Talmud it's called Pirkei Avot, I think that's the name. and it's basically a bunch of proverbs that you can draw from wisdom based on your interpretation or just advice on how to live in a society and how society should function. So I think Christianity is very similar in that aspect that it's a faith where you can draw wisdom and certain ideals to follow, and that in turn can help shape your life more positively.
And it ought to be that way. There would be no Christianity if there was no Judaism. Um, we owe a huge debt to your ancestors, um, because you gave us the original Proverbs. You gave us our Savior. The early church was almost exclusively Jewish, and it was only as they spread out that they began to take in people who didn't have that heritage. But those proverbs, that wisdom, it's built into us from the start because of the gift that you folks have given.
Well, I guess we'll accept on behalf of
Except on behalf of the Jewish nation. No, but yeah, like, and
Uh,
this is kind of like a commonality we've seen. So we've interviewed also imams and Muslim scholars, and like it's kind of just a mutual shared appreciation for all three of our cultures, our monotheistic cultures, because without any one of us, our faith would not be as each of our faiths would not be as strong as they are. And just like having us three, even though we're so different, allow us to basically strengthen our beliefs in our respective religions. And Alice, did you want to move on with the next question?
Sure. So, with how we think the current climate is and how things are going on a sociological scale, what do you think is the future of Christianity?
well, I believe and I surely hope that it's very bright. Um, I suppose if anybody could get into their time machine and go back centuries or even millennia, uh, and view the culture and view the challenges they had, um, it might give them more of an appreciation for the resilience that faith has given to us. Um, I know that in the 1700s they didn't sing the same songs that we sing in our worship services, at least not all of them. Uh, I'm sure the preaching styles were different. I'm sure that the moral climate was different. The challenges was different. Go back even farther, and it was more different still. Faith has to adapt to whatever culture it's in, and I feel that because God is the author of faith, and because He knows history and He superintends history, that He is going to give us whatever tools we need for the climate that we're in. And Christianity has thrived um, under every kind of government, uh, from kings to dictators to communism. When the Berlin Wall fell, when the Soviet Union was dissolved, for decades and decades, they had officially been an atheist culture. But we saw that there were thriving communities of faith within that culture still. And so it couldn't be stamped out. Now, it was a different expression of the Christian faith than I'm accustomed to. But Jesus was still the center of it. That was important. And I'm sure it's that way for communities of Jewish people. Um, we have to adapt, and we will adapt, because if you don't adapt, you die. Uh, I feel like the denominational structures are in decline. The numbers show that fewer people attend whatever denominational church than did decades ago. But in in that loss, there's also been gains because there are many, many storefront churches. There are many, many groups that meet in homes and don't have a denominational structure of any kind. There are many prayer groups that meet in whatever place of business or work. And so it adapts to the change of culture, and it adapts to whatever needs there are in the community where they exist. And I think that'll continue, even though you probably won't see as much emphasis on the big name of the church or the big name of the group. Now there's a huge emphasis on the mega church now, and I'm sure they can provide many, many services that small churches cannot. Um, but there are some people, and I'm definitely one of them, just a little frightened of that because it's almost like Walmart or Microsoft developed a church. And so it's just this huge structure that just takes over life. Um, and I much prefer the intimate, small culture of the church that I'm in. But there's room for all of it. Um, there's room for any group that says, here's what God has said, here's what we can do with it, and we'll develop our own distinctive worship style, and we'll express our teachings in this way. Um, and I see great value in saying, this is what the Bible says, and this is what I will believe, and this is how I will worship.
Yeah, I think, like you said, secularism is definitely increasing in Western society, but at the same time, I think the foundations of Western culture in general, especially from a moral and ethical aspect, are really derived from, Judaism and Christianity. So I think despite that increasing rise of atheism and agnosticism, overall, it will still thrive in one way or another just because that culture is so ingrained within Christianity and Judaism as a whole. That's really, it's the only way to thrive. You have to accept a part of it.
Yeah, and there are, I don't know of any cultures that have been discovered in any part of the world that don't have some kind of faith, some sense of some creative force bigger than the community that brought the world into being. And I believe it's an aspect of what God said in the earliest parts of Genesis when He said, "Let us make man in our image," and that imageness means we bear something of who God is. We speak with similar categories. We have a similar sense that some things are right and some things are wrong. Now, I may occasionally need teaching to refine my sense of what is right, wrong, or what it is that God did exactly when He made this world. But there is a sense in all of us that something uh, got it started, and something is guiding the course of history, and something is creating hope, even in darkness. And so this allows the human species to thrive. And if we ever make it to Mars, I'm sure there'll be a church planted on Mars. Uh, don't know what it would look like, but there'll be Martian believers if we get there. And I think Mr. Musk is wanting to do that pretty quickly, but that's a different conversation.
So,
Yeah, that is definitely a different conversation, but um, yeah, what you say definitely resonates, and it's just it is interesting. Um, kind of just like looking at when you look at a far out lens, no matter where you are, it is true that like I guess culture does always exist. But like a question on that, what would you say as to like in Soviet Russia or in communist China when religion was abolished, and for that time period, religion did not exist in all regions of the world. Um,
Well, but it does. In all these places, there are or have been documented uh, churches that met in secret, churches that found a way around whatever regulation there was. And this, um, in the earliest days of our faith, people had ways of identifying themselves to others who were like minded. And they could have a fellowship that somehow allowed them to uh, transmit their beliefs and their hopes, even in the face of what looked like overwhelming opposition. And I think that's an aspect of our human nature and our imageness as well. Um, we will give our lives for our faith. Um, Maybe everybody doesn't when presented uh, that that threat, but many have, and that's a defining thing about a faith that will endure. That people see it as more valuable than their dearest possession, and there's nothing more dear than the life that each of us is given. And so, if we would uh, face that threat and push through, no matter what happens, that speaks to the strength of what we believe, and people do that. I'm not hearing.
Okay, I think you're muted.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's true. I didn't think about it from that perspective. And I guess, yeah, in that case, I guess religion and culture is also what you define it as to be. And I guess for me, like, I guess just think about it from like the established religions, but culture itself and like how like, I mean, it's just a culture without religion is a culture itself because that's the culture of like that society. Um, but like, yeah, I guess that spin on it is super interesting. Do you have any other like thoughts on that before like I move on to the next question?
Well, just that, and others have said it very eloquently that um, uh, we are incurably religious as a species. Now, not everybody expresses that religion in the sense of worshiping a god or gods. For some people, it's a religion of philosophy or confidence in the human ability to persevere, or rationalism, or some other such thing. But when you get down to the root of it, the devotion to it is a religious devotion. We are all devoted to something that we believe, and we all build our lives around and make our decisions based on that belief structure.
Yeah, there's no large scale human um what's the word? There's no large scale human cooperation without some sort of thing to that everyone can really agree on. So religion or communism or atheism or humanism, like in order to build a society, there needs to be some sort of shared value and belief system that everyone can really work with.
And it's that way at every
Mhm.
level of human organization. If two people meet on the street, either a common language or a common desire to eat or a common desire to be protected from bears, something is going to give them a framework within which to relate to one another. And however big that group gets beyond that, it's going to be built around some organizing principle.
Yeah, that's true. And then like moving on to the next question because I think like they're kind of closely related in terms of like the different societies of, I guess, when you look back into like prehistoric and, or not I mean, prehistoric's pretty far back, but historic and modern day societies. Why is like the Old Testament God much more different than the New Testament God? And just for some context, could you just like provide some examples of that difference and then also like how
Well,
that difference affects religion going forward?
yeah. It's a huge subject. Um,
Yeah, it's probably a
I
loaded
would
question.
I would argue that the differences are just related to the spans of time over which they're expressed. The New Testament was written in under 100 years, and that was their slice of their world. Now, it was written with a view toward whatever centuries to come. The Old Testament was written over a time frame that was 40 times that size, 4,000 years. Now, my numbers may be off a little bit. Um, so the focus is going to look a little different. And when God speaks to a character from the Old Testament versus how he speaks to a character from the New Testament, one's at a different stage of development than the other. When God spoke to Noah, he didn't give him the same information he gave to Abraham, but what Abraham had was built on what Noah knew and had passed on. And so it's going to look a little different. Even if you narrow it down to a single book of the Old Testament, the book of Exodus, for example, when that book opens, God is relating to a single individual, Moses. Moses is out uh, on the in a wilderness area tending sheep, and he sees a bush on fire but not consumed. God relates to him right there, and it's just him and just Moses, and that's all there is. And out of that comes this huge cascade of events that by the time you get to the end of the book of Exodus, God is in a relationship with multiple tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, and they have this tabernacle established and they're having worship in it, and they're able to relate to God as a community. So it's different from the time of the beginning of a single book than the time of the end. But they're not different in such a way that it makes God different. His characteristics are immutable. Uh, all the things that we know about God from the earliest point are still true in the later points. So, in that sense, I don't think it's so much of a difference in God's character. Now, there are a lot of people who do believe that they're totally different gods. In the second century, there was this dude named Marcion, and he thought that the God of the Old Testament was mean and spiteful, and that there was no way that such a God could relate through a son like Jesus. And so he created his own set of scriptures. And if he didn't like something that somebody written, he just cut it out. And so uh, he had an odd sense of who God was and how God relates through time. He found himself excommunicated for that, and so his influence waned rather quickly. But there have been a lot of people who have tried to view the God of the Old Testament different than the God of the New, but it's not so different. You see a lot of love expressed in the Old Testament. You see a lot of love expressed in the New Testament. You see Jonah going to preach at Nineveh, and the Ninevites repent. They change. God sees that, and he relents of the disaster that he had thought to bring on them. And Jonah gets really upset about that because he wanted God to smite them. Uh, so God was a forgiving God in that sense. God is still a forgiving God. Um, there's a quote from Isaiah 55 that invites people to come to the waters, come and drink, come without money, come without price, be filled. And you see in the New Testament Jesus standing up on the last day at a feast, and he says, "If any man thirst, let him come to me and drink. He that believeth, as the Scripture saith, out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water." So, in both senses, there's this acknowledgement that there is a hunger and a thirst within each human being that only God can fill. And Isaiah expressed that, and Jesus expressed it in very similar terms. Come and drink. Whatever itch there is, whatever thirst there is, whatever hunger there is, God can satisfy. And so, in that sense, there's not a great deal of difference. And I believe that most of the differences that people point to are related to changing circumstances, changing threats, changing opportunities, um, even changing climates. It could have been the same in Canaan as it was in Egypt. It's just different, and so they had different things to contend with, and different friends, different enemies, and God related wherever they were in a way that preserved their sense of His unchanging character.
Yeah, because I always was thinking that um the God of the Old Testament or the Torah was more so, like you said, that the person in the second century said was more like more angry as he's described, I believe,
Mm.
while the New Testament God was more merciful. But it's interesting how you can still see those parallels of kindness and mercy in both of the books,
Mm.
which really shows how it's the
Yeah.
same God that's being worshipped.
And um, when Jesus presented Himself, He presented as representing the hope that Abraham had. God said to Abraham, "I'm going to bless every tribe in the world through your seed, through you." And Jesus is presented as that seed, that everyone can be blessed. Everyone can experience God's presence and His peace and God's joy and hope. The New Testament writers, every single one, expressed to their world, even though in some cases it was not a Jewish world, they still presented the gospel using Old Testament terms and quoting Old Testament writers. So they did not see a huge change or difference between. In fact, they saw the God of the Old Testament as exactly the God of the New and exactly the Father of Jesus.
Hmm. That's, I guess, like interesting. You could see like the difference in like historical events, but really when you look it down to like the fundamentals, he hasn't changed all that much. Why do you think that people think that there's such a difference between Old Testament God and New Testament God?
Well, they do see things in the Old Testament that are not commanded in the New. When Joshua goes into the promised land after the death of Moses, there's a war that takes place, and nowhere in the New Testament are we told to make war on anybody. So things like that stand out to many people. There are a lot of regulations in the Old Testament, and breaking a lot of those regulations did result in capital punishment, and those things are not expressed the same way in the New. So I think some people look at that and say, well, they couldn't be the same. But in the New, there is this sense of no matter where you come from, no matter what your background, no matter what you've done, there is acceptance with God if you come to Him in belief. If you will trust Him, you will experience forgiveness and you will experience peace. You will experience hope.
Interesting. And um, I guess moving on to the next question that we had, which sort of has to do with that retention of faith. As an ordained minister, have you ever doubted God? If so, how do you overcome such doubt? And if not,
Yeah.
why have you been so certain of his existence and where
Yeah.
the
Well, ordained ministers don't like to acknowledge ever having doubt, but I think everybody has some level of it. And I got to go back to there's an incident in the New Testament where this individual, his name is John. He's called John the Baptist, not because he was part of a Baptist church, but because he baptized people. He was John the Baptizer, I suppose. Um, he was considered to be the forerunner of Jesus, the guy who introduced Jesus to the world. And he finds himself in prison, and he later on is beheaded because he's offended people in authority. Um, and while he's in prison, he sends two of the people who've been following him to see Jesus. Now, he and Jesus had an earlier uh, shared experience where John baptized Jesus, and beautiful scene. But he sends two of his followers to ask Jesus, "Are you really the one that we're looking for? Are you the one that was promised, or do we need to be looking for someone else?" And you can sense that frustration. He's in prison. He's lost his freedom. He's probably by this point certain that he's going to lose his life. And he doesn't doubt so much that God exists or that God's involved in the world. He's just not sure of how it's playing out and what the roles really are. And he may be concerned that Jesus is going to be a different kind of Messiah than he's been proclaiming or hoping for, at least. But Jesus' response was, go back to John and tell him this. Tell him that the blind are seeing, the lame are walking, the lepers are being cleansed, the deaf are hearing, the dead are being raised, and good news is being proclaimed to the people. That's a fairly loose paraphrase. So things were happening, and he wanted John to remember that even though his personal circumstances were difficult, things are happening. Now, there have been a handful of times where it seemed super critical to me that a certain thing come to pass, and I would pray about that, and God, fix this. And in a handful of those cases, it's as though God said no. And it wasn't so much a doubt that God is there, but it's like, what are you up to? What is your plan? What is your purpose in this? Am I fitting into my part of that role? That kind of doubt I
So
have
it's not a
experienced.
doubt. It's not a doubt with his existence. It's rather like a doubt with. It's just a concern as to like why he didn't act a certain way.
Yeah, and I believe all of us have some preconceived notion of what God ought to do in whatever circumstance. And skeptics will routinely say, well, if God is really good, if God is really powerful, then why are people still hungry or diseased? Or why do children suffer at the hands of pedophiles? Whatever evil there is and those are serious questions, and I don't know that there is a good answer to that in this world, except that we live in a world that really is cursed by sin and bad things are going to happen. But it's not really the end of the story. There is an eternity beyond this. Now, I'm not saying anybody deserves, in any sense, to face some of the horrible things that have been done to people. I'm not saying that at all. But God does take a long view of things, and there will be justice in the end. The books will balance. There's a whole branch of study that people look to called apologetics, and I love apologetics, and I love studying the arguments for God's existence and things of that nature. But I don't know many people. In fact, I don't know personally anybody that's become a Christian because of a so-called proof of God. I think there has to exist some sense within themselves that they want to explore the option. Are you there? And I believe that for the person who will honestly pray, Lord, if you're there, please help me to see it, understand it, come to know it, whatever. But I think that the field of apologetics and the arguments that are made probably have their greatest value in helping someone who has made a decision to come to faith, to strengthen their resolve to remain in it and to walk in it. And I don't think there's anything more powerful than the presence of the Holy Spirit for keeping someone grounded in their faith and helping them through those times of great difficulty or even questioning. But there's some beautiful ideas out there that are being presented, and every age has its arguments for the presence of God and for the nature of God that are extra biblical. And some of these go back even to the Greeks before the time of Christ. Um, but every age needs also to look at its world and develop a contemporary argument for saying, hey, you can see God in the world that you live in. And one of the ones that I enjoy the most right now is it comes from people who look at the complexity of life. Each one of us is made up of 30 trillion cells. And in each one of those cells, there is this intricate machinery that is amazing. And I mean, just the animations of it um, are astounding. And all that life is built on the language of DNA, four little uh, chemical types that
Yeah.
in combination code for everything that you and I are and everything that any other living thing is. And the idea is that just like the computers that we're speaking through, there is a programming language that tells the machinery how to operate. And DNA is that programming language. And language comes from mind. It doesn't come from chance. My iPad did not assemble itself, and the first iPad didn't assemble itself, and the first cell phone didn't, it didn't happen by chance. Someone designed it. And the life that I have, the life that is part of every one of my 30 trillion cells, and every tree and every plant, every other thing, is built on this language, and it screams out that there's a designer, there's a programmer who set all this in motion. And I know that the skeptics and purely naturalistic philosophers will say that if you have the chemicals and enough time, it's going to happen. But there's good arguments that the complexity of the life that we have is such that it would never, ever self-assemble, no matter how much time you allow for it. Psalm 19 tells us that the heavens declare the glory of God. We look out at the universe that God has made, and it's bigger every time we look, and every time we come up with a more powerful telescope, we see more and more of it, and it's all finely balanced. And the forces that hold everything together are so finely tuned that if any one of them were different than they are, stars wouldn't be possible, chemistry wouldn't work, life wouldn't exist. So it's finally, wonderfully tuned. Psalm 139 tells us to kind of look inward and reminds us that if we really consider things now, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. There is a beauty about life and its development that's amazing. I have a brand new granddaughter, and she's 5 weeks old. And my daughter sent all these ultrasound pictures, and she would she would always compare the size of this baby to whatever fruit she had. Well, the baby's the size of a strawberry. The baby's the size of a lemon. And she worked her way up till all of a sudden she didn't say watermelon, but all 6 pounds of this beautiful baby came into the world recently, and she is wonderfully made, fearfully made, and that is a gift of creative and wonderful God who still has confidence that people can navigate this world and get through difficulties and hopefully, prayerfully come to faith in Him and be thankful to Him.
Yeah, and even beyond the realm of biology, I mean, even equations of physics, there's something beautiful about them in the sense that, for example, kinematics, where you have to account for different speeds and times and positions. Even with that limited information, you would think, okay, what can I really do with this information? Somehow, the way that that natural world works is you're able to account for, say, differences in movement and whatnot. And to me, I think I was thinking about this the other day. I think that's something incredible to say about the world.
Yeah, and something that like honestly, um, I guess like you hear the more you study, it's not possible to understand God, and you hear that, and like for a while, that's like almost rendered me hopeless because I'm like, oh, no matter what I do, I won't
Yeah.
really understand it. But
Well,
last year, I took a genetics course, and by by like learning about I guess God it like himself and like through education you maybe cannot understand him because it's just not possible, but you can understand how he exists. So for example, like genetics is just so in depth, like how you were saying DNA, like there's RNA, tRNA, mRNA, there's so much that goes into it that and it's so perfect that you almost like that's why I can't commit to not believing in a God because like how could there not be some superior being that's coded all of this because of how intricate it is. So the more you
yeah,
study, the more you realize like just how amazing it is.
it is absolutely. And if you think about the feedback mechanisms in every cell, uh, the repair mechanisms for even when the DNA strand breaks, and somehow it knows to put it back together and to put it back together correctly. And I know there's the occasional mistake, and uh, they usually turn out badly for that cell anyway. But there's so many wonderful pieces of tiny, tiny machinery that keep things moving and keep things stable and keep us going, keeps our species going. And it was a great design, and as you said, it bolsters our ability to look at a world and say there must be a God behind it. Now, there are two branches of knowledge about God, and the ones that we're talking about with DNA and fine tuning of physical parameters and galaxy structure and whatnot. That's it's called general revelation. It's the sort of thing that we can look out and see. Paul references that in Romans chapter 1 when he says that the invisible things of God are made visible in the creation. But there is beyond that, because looking at stars and looking at DNA will remind us of a designer, but he won't tell us what the designer wants from us, other than to live. It won't tell us how to treat one another or how to express our gratitude to him. And so that branch of understanding is very specific, and it's because he speaks. And we should expect that a God who is there would speak because he made us in his image. And he made us with minds, and he made us to communicate with one another and to communicate with our world. And so why wouldn't we be able to breathe a prayer to him? And why wouldn't we be able to, in some sense, understand when he speaks to us? And I surely wish that I got emails from God every day, but I don't. But I do have a lot of his words uh, in my scriptures, and they tell me a lot about him, and they tell me how to relate to folks around.
It's just incredible. I think it's
It's
I'm at a
truly
loss for words.
a work of art. Yeah, I mean if we could email them that'd be nice as well. But yeah, it's just truly remarkable and I think this is a great way to end the interview. Do you have like any finishing thoughts or final words before we culminate?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, and
Thank
it's very nice to meet you folks, sort of in person. And I wish you every blessing, every peace, every joy, and every answer to any and all the questions that you have, because I know they're there.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for everything. And with
Thank
that
you.
said, that
That's
was a
amazing
wonderful essay.
conversation.
Um, Wonderful ending. Thank you guys so much. And we'll see you for episode 14. Bye.
Lord
Bye.
bless you.